Hello, everybody. Good morning. We're just letting some more people come into the webinar, so we're going to get started very, very shortly. Thanks for your patience as we get started on this beautiful sunny Wednesday morning. All right, Dana, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, hello everybody. So glad to be here with you all this morning. My name is Diana Falchuk and I work with the City of Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative in a partnership between the Office of Arts and Culture and Office for Civil Rights. And I'm one of the funder representatives in our Creative Equity Fund Funders Collaborative. I use she, her pronouns and identify racially as white. Jonathan, over to you.
Hey, everybody. Good morning. I've just got my earbuds in, so if you couldn't hear me before, I apologize. My name is Jonathan Cunningham. I am Senior Program Officer with Seattle Foundation. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and we're really glad to have everybody here with us this morning. So as you know, this is the this is the Creative Equity Fund that we're going to be talking about, this 2021-2022 RFP that was just released. And we'll just kind of go through it. We'll cover a variety of things in terms of the questions that are going to be asked, what we're looking for. So we're really excited to get a chance to let everybody learn more about the grant program itself. But before we get started, next slide. It's really important to acknowledge the land that we're on. And so Seattle Foundation sits on land which is the traditional home of the Coast Salish people. We acknowledge them as the original and current stewards of this region. It's been said before that land acknowledgements are important, but actions are more important. We hope that this grant program is a step in the right direction. Next slide.
Thanks, Jonathan. So before we get going with our presentation portion, which will be roughly about the first half of our time together, we want to let you know that we are going to have time for a question and answer at the end. And we're asking you to keep yourselves muted for this first part, in part because we're recording. And that if you have any questions, hang on to them. When we get to the Q&A portion, you can either put those into the chat and writing if that's how you prefer to do it, or you can raise your hand and we'll call you off mute and invite you to share your question with the whole group. So just a little bit about this program, kind of, where it started and what the approach is. I think probably everybody who's in this conversation today knows that, arts and culture are really the oldest connective tissues in human communities. And our movements for racial and social justice have been using arts and culture to bring us together to organize for justice and liberation forever. They're powerful mind, body, and spirit tools for disrupting and dismantling structural racism and its harmful effects, from the deep disparities in health and education, economic inequity as another disparity that it can interrupt, and police brutality. And just want to send some love to all the folks who are really feeling what's going on in Minnesota, Minneapolis, and continued police brutality toward Black lives, violence toward Black lives. We started talking about Creative Equity Fund in 2017 as we wanted not to just fund this important and necessary work, but we also wanted to really lift up BIPOC-led work that was using arts and culture to dismantle structural racism. And we wanted to create a fund that was dedicated to kind of showing the ecosystem of strategies that BIPOC-led orgs were using to do this really important transformational work. Next slide, please. Thank you, Zandra, for doing the tech and supporting us and advancing our slides, among other things. So we have kind of 5 goals for the Creative Equity Fund. This first one, really connected to our purpose, is that we want to grow community power in the face of racial injustice. Second one is that we want to build the capacity of BIPOC-led grassroots, community-based organizations to use arts and culture as strategies for undoing structural racism. And want to stress here, and we'll talk about this more later, that this fund is not only for arts and cultural orgs, it's for all this cycle Black and Indigenous orgs, which we'll talk about, who are using arts and culture to dismantle structural racism. And that third one is really focusing on improving outcomes, so tangible outcomes for youth, elders, low-income residents, and communities of color who are disproportionately impacted by structural racism and its intersections with other forms of oppression. Next slide, please. We also want to engage residents in experiences that imagine a just and liberated world. And we want to organize for systems and policy change using arts and cultural strategies. Next slide, please. So want to name that while Jonathan and I are sharing here from our different organizations, we are a collaborative of funders. So Seattle Foundation houses the fund, administers the fund, but it is a collective effort. So on the screen, you'll see the list of funders who are supporting this, and want to give a shout out to any of the funders who are on this call too. And thank you for your collaboration in this important work. I'll kick it back to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Diana. As Diana said, this is a funder collaborative, and we're all really excited about the direction of this grant program as an exploratory effort, which is allowing all of us to not only move dollars out to nonprofits who do great work, but also really learn from one another. We hope to really learn from the organizations that get funded and truly try to shift philanthropic practices to make them more just and decolonized. Building relationships between and amongst grantees and between the grantees and the funders is really an important part of this grant program. You will hear us talk about this as a cohort model. So I do want to name that we do approach this as a cohort model. After the organizations are selected for funding, we will have quarterly sessions for the grantees with funders present. And so this is a space for grantees and funders to really learn together. Topics that are discussed at the quarterly gatherings are chosen by the grantees, and there's ongoing opportunities of learning for funders. So there are, just to break it down, there are spaces where as we eventually get a cohort selected, we will meet quarterly over the course throughout 2021 and 2022 with funders present, and really just begin to unpack some things that are really looking at how we can have more decolonized philanthropy and ways to really increase learning opportunities and strengthening relationships between Black and Indigenous-led organizations. Just recognize just the need to do some building and some repair there. And so we'll talk a little bit more about why we've gone in this direction. Next slide.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, and so as Jonathan has already been describing, this is really a community-centered model. Unlike traditional grant making, community really informs, leads, and helps to implement the Creative Equity Fund. So when we made our first grants back a couple of years ago, we brought together 2 BIPOC groups of community members who have knowledge in arts and culture and relationships in the arts and culture community. One of those groups designed the RFP and the criteria and kind of how are we selecting organizations? Where is our focus? And another then reviewed all the applications and made all the funding decisions in that first round. Creative Equity Fund will continue to have this participatory grant making process, really to allow for broader community input, and so importantly, to make sure that we as funders are not determining who receives grants or the grant amounts. So these are practices that we're putting into place so that the fund and its partners are forging a more equitable and collaborative kind of philanthropy. And next slide, thank you.
Great. And as I see some people are still just joining, just a reminder, we will have space for questions at the end. So feel free to hold your questions. And of course, if you want to put a question in the chat, we will have a chance to take a look at it as well. So whatever you prefer, but we're definitely going to make space for questions. So, focus on Black and Indigenous Native-led organizations. What does that mean and why? Really just kind of want to unpack that. Really, it's just to address the philanthropic sector's historic underinvestment in Black and Indigenous organizations while really focusing on arts and culture strategies for racial justice. We know that there's a lot of research that looks at this. In 2020, Seattle Foundation published a case for investing in King County's Black-led organizations as a research report in collaboration with Bird Bar Place and Cardia Services. And that report was incredibly illuminating. And within that, even just a few nuggets to pull out, 44% of survey respondents stated having annual operating budgets of $250,000 or less. Nearly 2/3 of survey respondents listed having 3 months or less of cash reserves. A recent study from Echoing Green also looked at the unrestricted net assets for Black-led organizations being 76% smaller than their white counterparts. And with Native-led organizations, the funding disparities are equally bleak. According to a 2019 report from the First Nations Development Institute, less than 1% of total community foundation giving goes to support Native American causes and organizations. So the Investing in Native Communities report, which was released in 2016, looked at the largest US foundations gave 0.4% of their total annual funding to Native American communities. That's really bad, right? And so we recognize that the philanthropic sector has underinvested in Black-led organizations. It has underinvested in Indigenous-led organizations. And it's time to change that. And so just thinking of the work of John Powell, we're taking a targeted universalism approach of intentionally and unapologetically moving untethered resources to Black and Indigenous-led organizations that we can support, strengthen relationships with, and truly learn from over the next 2 years. We think that philanthropic leaders in this region stand to learn a lot from Black brilliance and Indigenous wisdom. So this cohort can really influence how we do grant making collectively and our individual institutions. And that part is really important. Imagine a space where Black brilliance and Indigenous wisdom is together collectively over the course of 2 years to strengthen relationships amongst one another, to be able to potentially plan events together, to really grow, to do some healing and some repairing. And then also, and to be totally honest, and to also keep it 100 as you're giving feedback to the philanthropic sector about how we can better support your organizations. So we think it will be that type of a space. And so it's actually really important to both drive that home. And then we'll also talk about the sort of the criteria and sort of why that's important. Next slide, Zandra. So hopefully everyone can see, we are taking an expansive view of both Black and Indigenous led, like how are we meaning that? Obviously, as I've said, Black and Indigenous can mean a lot. So as I said, some of this is in the FAQ, and I'm actually going to take just briefly, hopefully everybody has taken a chance. If you've signed up for the webinar, hopefully you also got a chance to take a look at the FAQ, but I'm just going to drop the FAQ in the chat for anyone that possibly hasn't seen it, because it really does answer a lot of questions. So just bear with me. And this is all posted on our website as well. And then just also as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. So if anybody has to drop off or join later, or if you wanted to pass this along, we will post this after this is complete. So yes, as I said, how are we defining Black and Indigenous? So one, while the focus will be on moving resources to organizations led by and serving, like I'm just looking at both populations. So we will have a focus on moving resources to organizations that are led by and serving the native-born Black populations that have been historically underfunded by philanthropy for centuries. Groups from across the African diaspora are eligible to apply. This includes the Afro-Latinx community, the Caribbean, African immigrant-led groups. Similarly, traditional Coast Salish organizations who are the stewards of this current region will be prioritized. However, organizations led by and serving Indigenous populations broadly are certainly eligible to apply and considered for funding. And again, one reminder is that everybody just has to be based in King County. Given the rise, it feels very important to speak to, given the rise in violence against the Asian American Pacific Islander community, one question might be, can nonprofits representing that demographic apply? With our expansive view of Indigenous populations, Pacific Islander-led nonprofits are absolutely encouraged to apply. This can include groups representing Chamorros, Fijians, Native Hawaiians, Samoans, the entire Pacific Islander diaspora. It could also mean Indigenous-led nonprofits serving populations throughout Latin America. But very important, we really want to hold the integrity of this program. We are focusing on moving our dollars to groups that have been critically underfunded and building a cohort of Black and Indigenous nonprofits that will meet regularly. If that's not actually a part of your leadership structure, it's okay to be honest and not try to sneak in. The best way for me to say it is, please don't, if you're a white-led organization and you're just trying to fudge some of the numbers, please don't gentrify this grant program. There are other grant opportunities and other funding opportunities that all of our entities have. Seattle Foundation has a ton of other grant programs. Our Office of Arts and Culture, For Culture, Satterberg Foundation, we all have a ton of other grant programs. We really want to focus this on Black and Indigenous-led organizations. And again, because we will be meeting as a cohort, if you're not a Black and Indigenous-led organization, it certainly will come out. So that part would be awkward. So don't put yourself in that position. And we obviously are going to do our due diligence to really hold the integrity of this program. Next slide.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. Folks, we want to share that this is really an evolution of our journey as a funders collaborative and a funding program. When Creative Equity Fund did its first 2-year cycle, which just ended, we already had Black and Indigenous led orgs. There are some brilliant photos of that work here, and just want to name some of those organizations. Hip Hop is Green, Indigenous Showcase, Chief Seattle Club, Northwest African American Museum, CD Forum, Northwest Tap Connection. There's so much brilliance in those groups, and I'm sure that many of you know these groups and have gotten to experience what they do. So just a shout out to them and a thank you to them. Next slide, please. Okay, so who is eligible? We have an eligibility quiz. This is just a way that helps us sort through the grants. And this is the first part when you go to fill out the grant application. So the first one is confirming that you're based in King County. The second one is confirming that you either have a 501c3 or you're fiscally sponsored by an organization that has a 501c3. You also need to have at least 2/3 of staff leadership by Black or Indigenous or Native people. If your organization is volunteer-led, you need to have leadership that is at least 2/3 Black and or Indigenous people as well. And you need to have at least 25% Black and or Indigenous people on your board of directors. The last questions that we ask is to make sure that your organization is actively, intentionally working to dismantle structural racism and build racial justice. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so what are we looking to fund? When we put this together and really listening to the community co-designers who came together, that BIPOC group, and came together and created Creative Equity Fund, it was clear that people wanted to lift up the range of ways that arts and culture are being used as strategies to dismantle structural racism and build racial justice. So we really want to lift up and shed light on that ecosystem of different strategies. So that includes infusing arts and culture into your community organizing, advocacy, and policy work. Had some beautiful examples of that in the last cohort. Developing intentional relationships between Black and Indigenous organizations using arts and culture, telling the story of structural racism related to perhaps one or more pressing current issues affecting our community. And this can include, really importantly, intersections with other forms of oppression. So for example, in our last cohort, Surge Reproductive Justice was one of our grantees, and they were really looking at that intersection of reproductive justice and structural racism, or reproductive rights and structural racism. Engaging people in experiences that imagine a just and liberated world, and then growing community power. This one is so important in the face of a current or impending racial justice. We can go to the next slide. Thank you.
So in terms of the application itself, organizations will need to set up an account on Founded, which is our online grants management program. Many people have used it before. If you have an account already, you can just use your regular login and password. You will be also asked if your organizational profile is up to date. That's Seattle Foundation's sort of data management task. We're aiming to do a much better job of really tracking where our dollars are going in the communities served by our support. And so we know organizations have staffing changes and some info could be out of date. So if you've updated that within the last 5 months, you're good to go. And if not, you'll want to make sure that info is up to date. Important to note, you do not have to have your organizational profile completely up to date to complete the application. But if your organization is selected for funding, you will need to have your organizational profile up to date before we're able to release any funding. And again, this is really just to ensure that we're able to really track where our dollars are going, communities served, et cetera. So it's really important that you have your org profile up to date. And then other than that, the application itself is meant to be intentionally short. Like as Diana already went over the eligibility quiz. So as you get to the application, that means you would have answered all of the questions honestly and proceeded to the application. And at that point, it's intentionally just really direct and short. There's only 8 questions. There's 2 sections, project purpose and activities and outcomes. We really want to have an understanding of how are you going to be using these dollars. That's incredibly important to us. How will you be using the dollars? Where is your particular area of focus? Like you describe what aspects of structural racism your organization works to address and how your organization is actively working to build racial justice. We'll also want to have a better understanding, you'll have the opportunity to list any proposed activities and a general time frame for your scope of work associated with the funding request. You'll want to also be able to list, obviously we're still in the global pandemic, so keep the need for social distancing in mind due to the COVID-19 pandemic and share how that will factor into your engagement strategy. So there'll just be a list of 4 questions in the project purpose section, 4 additional questions in the community engagement strategy section, which really, as we're talking about centering the most impacted communities, we want to know, how does your organization center the leadership and voices of those who are most impacted by the issues of structural racism that you work to address? What we're really asking is, how are you centering black brilliance and indigenous wisdom in all that your organization does? Really want to getting a sense, and then also, how is your organization accountable to those people? If you intend to partner with other organizations, we also ask, if applicable, please list what other local partners you'll be collaborating with if you receive the funding, including if there are any coalitions that you're a part of, and what racial demographics they represent. We're just really trying to get a sense on where the dollars might be going, and also like what partnerships, trying to also get a sense of if groups tend to work purely in isolation, or if there is a network of groups that you also work with. If there's any policy and advocacy campaigns that you may be utilizing these dollars for. I do want to stress, as I mean that, is there are many nonprofits that are sometimes doing some upstream systems and policy change work. One of our previous grantees, Surge Reproductive Justice, they really focus on maternal health for mothers of color, quite often Black and brown women. And they used the Creative Equity Fund grant dollars for the last grant cycle to do a series of arts and culture events, open mic nights. They called it Just Speaks. It was exclusive for people of color, and they paid DJs, they paid poets, they paid performers, bought food. They really had an arts and culture focused community organizing strategy. And then as people worked together at these in-person events, and as COVID happened, it obviously moved to virtual. As people would gather at these arts and culture focused events, they would then start to talk to the organizations about some of the legislative sessions and things that were relevant to policy and advocacy around maternal health. So if you're a non, and this is specifically helpful for some of the non-arts and culture-based organizations, I'll just want to come back to that point. Yes, we're focusing on arts and culture, so we know that arts and culture-focused organizations will apply to Creative Equity Fund, but it is open to non-arts and culture focused organizations, as long as you can be very clear in how you will infuse and use arts and culture as part of your strategy to be dismantling structural racism. And we also just want to know, like, what does success look like to you? How are you being evaluating success? So really short and straightforward. There's character limits. We'll also just want you to upload an organizational budget. If you have a fiscal sponsor, you can include your fiscal sponsor's information. I think this was said before. It would be good to know, you'll have to list if you're a 501c3, and if you're not, if you have a fiscal sponsor. So that's really important. You will list that. And then if there's any other questions, of course, you can always reach out to us if you have any questions along the way about that component. And yeah, next slide. So grant sizes, I don't want us to miss this part. Organizations can apply for up to $30,000 per year for 2 years. So the maximum grant amounts will be $60,000 over 2 years. We know some organizations may not request the full $60,000. You may just want 25, or what, it sort of depends. I should share that these are general operating dollars. So in the past, we originally, in the very first year that we did Creative Equity Fund, and listening to the feedback from the co-design group, we made space for organizations to apply for either project-based funding or general operating support. And it was fairly even split. Not everybody went the general operating support route. But we also recognized, so for the second year of Creative Equity Fund, rather than opening it up to the community, we realized that cohort, this is a part of the listening and the learning process, where the nonprofits are just continuously giving us feedback. And what we realized was that that 1 year was it was too short of amount of time. Organizations said that they were really just getting started to really build these relationships amongst one another and do work. And so we gave everybody an additional round of funding without them having to request it. We just re-upped with the previous cohort and gave them an additional round of funding. And that funding was general operating support. I think between those two things combined, that helped us realize that the next iteration, this current iteration that we're discussing today, this is a 2-year grant program, and these are going to be general operating support dollars. And just want to share that we have an overall general grant making budget of $600,000. And so we envision making 10 grants. Next slide. Diana touched on this a little bit earlier, but I just want to come back to this point around grant decisions. We want to remind folks, well, one is that a cross-sector group of Black and Indigenous community members will determine which organizations are selected and what funding amounts will be. So again, funders do not make grant decisions. So we really are just practicing turning over power to the community. It's just necessary. It's honestly not that big of a deal. We have a group of community members that identify as Black and Indigenous. There is Pacific Islander representation. We're just thinking broadly. And we're going to pay people for their time. They'll be reviewing the applications, possibly setting up site visits where applicable, and they'll make final decisions. None of the funders who have dollars in, we do not make grant decisions. I also just want to remind folks that the deadline to apply is May 3rd, Monday, May 3rd at 5 p.m. Please do not wait until the last minute. Get started on it. And if you need to share it with your grant writer, please do so. We recognize that I would say, please keep our capacity in mind. We very well may be responding to a number of inquiries. So if you have questions, the sooner you reach out, the better, to ensure that we're able to respond. Diana, my email address is on a lot of the material, so people can reach out to me, j.cunningham@seattlefoundation.org. And if there's other questions, I think now is a great place for us to make some space for Q&A. All right. So if anyone has questions, feel free. I don't know if anything has been put in the chat yet, but this is a space we want to get the first half of it. We want to just kind of go through it, and then we want to make space to answer any questions that grant seekers have.
Jonathan, there is one question in the chat from Eleni. How many folks on your committee? And just to clarify, Eleni, which committee, do you mean the grant reviewers group or the funders collaborative or both?
Yeah, both.
Jonathan, I'll let you take the grant reviewers part at least.
Sure. We have a group of 6 individuals that are going to be reviewing the grant applications, ensuring that there's multiple eyes on each application.
Hi, this is Toka. I have a quick question. Is there an age minimum for the organization applying for Creative Equity Fund?
When you say age minimum, like how long you've been in an organization?
Yeah, that's right.
No, not at all.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hi there. Are you able to put the Found It link in the chat for us?
Sure. Let me do that right now.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I have a question, Mr. Jonathan or Diana. This is Driscoll Jack with Gas and Coal Incorporated Ministry. New kid in town and with the Seattle Foundation, very encouraged by what I heard from the presentation, excellent presentation. And we mostly represent, as we are starting our grassroots organization with an underserved population of the Kofa Nation, especially with the language barrier and stuff like that. How do you help people of that background?
Jackie, can you state that one more time? I want to make sure I understand the question.
I want to thank you for the presentation. My question is geared toward the underserved population of the Micronesian and the Kofa Nation in the state of Washington. And also just want to see how we go about helping with a lot of services are not reaching us because of the underlying issue of the language barrier. Mm-hmm. And if your organization is geared toward helping in that regard, and also in considering us with that kind of work, so we can be, helping with the springboarding of it.
Well, how I want to answer that is, one, I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here. I think part of it is I hadn't heard of the organization before. This is a great learning opportunity for the funders. And now that we have your information, we will definitely be sharing more funding opportunities with everyone that's on the webinar and with all the organizations that apply. So, but in terms of the question that you asked, I can understand why language barriers are an issue. I think that we leave it to the organization itself. Like if your organization were to receive funding, like if the community reviewers were to say that they wanted to fund your organization, and if you know most intimately the issues that your community faces. We don't know them as much. You know them very, very acutely. So we leave that to you. If you think that if part of you want to use these dollars as part of helping to provide services to the Micronesian community, many of which have language barriers. That's totally fine. But again, we have to, what's imperative is to be really clear on how you're infusing arts and culture into your strategy for dismantling structural racism. I think even within language, I mean, there's a lot of white supremacy culture within language. Even this webinar itself is purely in English. We don't have any translation services, so I can understand that. But I'll just be really clear, where is the arts and culture component into your organization's work? If there's a clear component of arts and culture, and then additionally, some of the stuff that you're doing is providing services around COVID or language translation, that's totally fine. But that arts and culture has to be a component of what we're funding.
Okay, thank you. And just a point of clarification with your specificity of the art and culture. What are we really looking at in that terms you're talking about?
That's what we're hoping to hear from all of the organizations. So arts and culture can mean a lot. It can cover a lot of things. I think as Diana shared about the previous grantees, I'll just give like an example if this is helpful for everyone that's on the webinar today. We had a range of things. There was traditional arts and culture organizations. We had an art gallery, and again, of course, nonprofits. Art galleries that also focus on doing like the Guelaguetza and focusing on the Latino community. We had Hip Hop is Green as one of our previous grantees. They focus on culinary arts, food justice, cooking healthy food, vegan. They created a community garden, focusing on culinary arts and really disrupting the food deserts that often exist in Black communities. We had a capoeira organization that applied. They focus on martial arts, right? We had an organization that focused on maternal health, and they were, again, but doing arts, culture, and poetry nights, right? So they're doing a lot of policy and advocacy work, but they still made sure that they had our dollars. They have funding support from other sources, but the Creative Equity Fund dollars were specifically for their arts and culture series. And they were using that arts and culture series for community organizing purposes, and then they were advancing the work of their organization. So that has to be front and center.
Jonathan, I'm
Thank you.
noticing that, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Diana. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I'm noticing that Afua has a hand raised, and then there's probably like about 8 or so questions in the chat now that we might start to go through.
Let's do that.
What do you think about going to Afua's, because of your hand raise first and then move on to the chat?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you, Diana. Good morning. Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning.
Yes, I'm Afua with Adefua Cultural Education Workshop. This is amazing. I'm just wanting to find out quickly, are there things that you would like to see us provide in the application that you would pay for? And is there a strong match requirement?
Dan, I'll let you take that one.
Sorry, I had a dog barking. The first part of your question, Afua, was?
Are there specific line items that you would like to see us request in this opportunity? Like, would you like to see more artist fees that are attached to this collaboration for equity piece? Or
Got it.
is there a strong component for matching?
Got it. So there is no required match for the grant, so no need to be thinking about that. In terms of specific line items, not really. We are looking at those different areas of focus that we talked about. So thinking about, what is your organization's strategy? How are you using arts and culture to dismantle structural racism, to move the needle toward racial justice? And, why would this money be meaningful for you and your work?
Thank you.
I know there's a question in the chat, Jonathan. I'm seeing one about, let's see if we go up.
I'll take one. I saw Xandra just sent one over. It's a question about if an organization has received neighbor to neighbor funding, can they also apply for Creative Equity Fund? Absolutely. No question about that. Okay, let's start. We're just going to start looking through the chat.
Jonathan, I think Jamil had a question about.
Yep, I see it.
Great.
Jamil, do you want to come off mute?
Hey, sorry.
That's okay.
Thanks, Jonathan and everyone. Yeah, my question is just about our film media company is a OMWBE certified company, and we are South Asian. but our Muslim South Asians, but the majority of the content that we revolve around is around Black and Indigenous community. And this is like film work and stuff optimized for the internet. So I'm just wondering if that's applicable, and if not, would it be preferable to work with another organization to maybe bake that into their approach, or what have you? And thank you.
Sure, that's a good question. I probably want to say I kind of want to better understand it, and I know a little bit about the company itself, but you know it best. Hearing what I've shared before in terms of really wanting to focus on Black and Indigenous, like Native-led organizations, it does sound like a little bit outside of that. But I also just recognize, one, the power of media and narrative change. You might consider if there is an organization that you're closely aligned with that you know might be applying. You might consider if there's space for collaboration on a particular grant application, particularly if there's a focus on media representation, creating film content. I can certainly see film falling within arts and culture, but I know that prioritization is going to be going towards those Black-led and Native-led organizations, not just organizations that work with Black and Native-led organizations, if that makes sense.
Okay, perfect. No, that's great. Thank you so much.
Sure. And if you have more questions, just feel free to email me.
Do we want to go?
I'm looking at Toya's questions. For those who receive the grant funds, what does reporting process look like annually? So what we will work to build reporting elements with the funded grantees. We know that we will do at least a midterm report. So at the 1 year mark, we'll do a sort of a midterm report to ask how the work is going. And then we'll also do a final grant report. The exact aspects of that will still come together. But those will be the two main things. We don't actually ask people to do this. This is not city funding where we're really asking for detailed financials and dollar for dollar how every single dollar is spent. We actually trust you all to do the work. So we don't actually get into that. We really want to know, what have you learned? What things can you share with the funders? How can this program get better? Things of that nature. But then we also may ask some things that just haven't come up yet. I think once the cohort comes together, we will work with our evaluators to determine the right questions. But really just 2 reports. Hopefully that answers your question. And I see a question from Adam that says, what will the grantee collaborative entail? So as I was sharing earlier, Adam, we will have quarterly gatherings for the grantees. We'll probably have a kickoff. We envisioned, one thing we didn't share is the deadline to apply is May 3rd. And then we hope to be able to have a grant announcement out by the end of June. So we should hopefully know who all the grantees are by the end of June. And at some point over the summer, possibly in July, we may have a kickoff meeting, and then we will just meet quarterly. Usually for a few hours. There might be 2 or 2.5 to 3 hour gatherings, likely 3 hours, with grantees, with the selected organizations, who I'm calling grantees, together with the funder collaborative members. And we will just talk about what the intention of the grant program is. We'll get a little bit more into that and really create space for Black and Indigenous leaders to be able to work together, strengthen relationships, decolonize philanthropy together, really focus on healing. I think some shared understanding of the 2 communities is going to be really important. And we don't want to assume that everybody that's Indigenous understands the Black struggle and vice versa. So having some shared understanding of what the communities are facing is going to be really important. And then, as we said earlier, we also will probably poll the audience and try to get a better understanding of what are some key areas that the grantees really want to work on. There'll be some educational opportunities. So we really are going to build that together, but definitely plan for quarterly gatherings. And even though you didn't ask this, one thing that it's also in the FAQ is, in terms of the representation at those gatherings, 1 to 2 staff. It does not have to be the executive director of your organization or the CEO. That's not necessary unless they want to be there. But we really would just want whoever's doing the work. Whoever's doing the work should be at those gatherings.
Yeah, and I'll just say that they have been some of the most beautiful, transformative experiences for all of us, and the relationships that get built there. So, if you're applying, thinking about people might want to, set aside time to intentionally build relationship with other Black and Indigenous led orgs.
I'm going to take one more from the chat. Aaron is asking, so it sounds like funds can go toward capital costs such as building projects. So we think that the funds, this is general operating support. So we trust you, the organization, to utilize the funds as needed. That can cover administrative costs, paying for staff. Again, it really has to be focused on dollars going toward the use of arts and culture. So if it's a capital cost, if it's a sort of a building project that's related to arts and culture within those two communities, possibly, I think you're gonna have to make a really strong case. We really want to make sure that these dollars are going towards immediate deployment for utilizing for arts and culture. There have been some instances, particularly with COVID, where one of the grantees was using the funds to pay rent. And that was really an anti-gentrification, anti-displacement strategy because they weren't allowed to be able to do any programming in their building. But this is not meant to be these dollars are not meant to fund capital campaigns. So you just have to be really clear on specifically what you're looking to support. And Diana, if you want to take one from the chat as well,
Yeah,
great.
I'll take the one from George Lee. If leadership is between 50 and 75% Black, are they ineligible? I'll start with that first one. Again, I think it depends on how close to that 2/3 number you're talking about. And so just really thinking about, is it more toward the 2/3, which somewhere in that kind of 66% versus the 50%. So we really are trying to have like Black led and Black centric organizations, as well as Indigenous led and Indigenous centric. And then in terms of would the fund BIPOC led and design physical pedestrian infrastructure for pro-social public health and safety in a systemic disinvested in neighborhood? I think, again, similarly to what Jonathan was just sharing about capital projects, that we would just want to make sure that the project really is about arts and culture, and like make that connection between arts and culture as a strategy for moving the needle toward racial justice. And I think that's going to come down to the reviewers and like how they see that connection in terms of what it's doing and how it fits within the other applications. And I can take the next one. If our org is young and the majority of our community work has happened during the pandemic online, does it matter in terms of, no, I mean, I think, I'll finish the question, sorry. Does it matter in terms of providing visual documentation of our work in the application? No, we definitely want to receive applications from emerging organizations and to support that grassroots work. So, I think there are other ways to tell your story besides visual documentation. So I would encourage you to, think about what other ways you can do that. And as long as, again, it has that arts and culture piece and that moving the needle to dismantle structural racism piece, then please apply, yeah. I think there's the one from Albertus. Jonathan, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Are there specific criteria that would make application more attractive to the grant committee? Organization, collaborations, age of the organization. I think we shared the age of the organization is totally irrelevant. Target demographic is just really is your level of support. And I just want to, in case this detail was missed, it's important that we want to be able to support organizations that are both Black and Indigenous led and serving. And so that is an important detail. And if I didn't articulate that properly before, I apologize. And this is also a part of the nomenclature and the language. So particularly for Black-led organizations, if an organization has a Black ED and maybe a Black board director and there's Black leadership, but the core aspect of their work is actually not serving the Black community, then we don't consider that a Black-led and Black serving organization. So we also want it's imperative that the work that you're doing is actually reflective of the community that you represent and that you serve. So that's something that would make it more attractive to the grant committee. Collaborations are great, but how do I say this? It doesn't necessarily, certain organizations, it depends on the nature of your work. So, I'm not able to say that if you don't mention any collaborations, that's going to be a knock against you. It depends on if the work that you do is just relevant to what you do, and maybe there aren't a lot of other peer organizations, and that's what it is. So I don't want to have that as a knock against an application as well. The main things really is to make it attractive, is to just be really clear in what the community is that you serve. How you're going to be using arts and culture as part of your strategy to be dismantling structural racism. Is this work that you're already doing? How are you making it front and center that Black and Indigenous folks are a core part of your audience, or a core part of the work that you do, and then how you'll be infusing arts and culture. And I also think that one other component is the organizations who are applying their level of interest in doing some, and then just a reminder, if you're, to mute yourself. Just a reminder, I would say, is the level of interest in doing some collaborative work, like reaching across the aisle, Black-led organizations that are really excited to work with Indigenous-led organizations, and vice versa. I think having some level of mention of that is good, because again, this is going to be a space for that. And Delbert, I see you have a question. If you want to come back off mute, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Diane. Hello, family. You know, this is a great opportunity. So my question is actually a statement and a question. You know, having done this work for a while, like other people, one of the challenges I want to believe for some of us that are on this call is that we've had on this on our own, and a lot of time we're working in isolation. So the question really is, there is some amazing people that are applying. It'd be great for me to know who and what they do, because I believe the collaboration of the people on here would be extremely rich. That's the first thing I want to say. And the second thing I want to say is, who defines what art and culture is? We started thinking about colonization and white supremacy. You know, one of my biggest challenges personally was getting my work seen as art. I teach history. So there's always this part that I want to bring into the space, is that everybody doesn't necessarily sees certain things as art. And I'm just asking that question so we can get some clarity on when I apply, that my work gets seen as art, because I teach history.
Great. I'll take that. I'll take those in reverse. One, your work definitely falls within arts and culture. You know, I think that the breadth of it, without getting into it, definitely falls within arts and culture. We want to hear from the organizations who are applying and how you're defining what arts and culture is. I started to think that I'll just let Diana from the Office of Arts and Culture answer this question. But the reality is that for all the organizations that are applying, you tell us, you know, how the work that you're doing fits within arts and culture. I think that there are some fairly clear sort of common sense answers, but we also know that some things can be a little bit fuzzy. So we just kind of want to hear it from you. So there's that component. And then I think in terms of when organizations are selected, there will absolutely be opportunities for cross collaboration. That's going to be a focus of the cohort, because the deadline itself is May 3rd. And we know sometimes organizations won't even get started on it. I mean, I'm just being honest, right? So some organizations may not get started on it until over the weekend. It'll be really hard to share with you like who is applying before they've applied. I think it's probably more realistic for once organizations are selected and in the cohort, that's where the collaboration can really occur.
Great. And one more follow-up, you know, is the lens that selection going to be looking at those organizations that have been selected with an intention of collaboration based on the brilliance they bring individually?
It's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll say it this way. So I know that the reviewers will be reading individual applications, right? They'll be reading individual applications, scoring individual applications, and then determining which organization they feel like is strong and should possibly move forward. There'll be opportunities for possible site visits, which will be virtual, of course, and to gather more information. But I do think that we will hold that. I think I'm glad you mentioned that, and we will hold that. And that's why I shared. And we know that it's not automatic, right? So there are some, let's just be honest, there are some tension points between Black and Indigenous communities. There's a lot of commonality. I have always wanted to see more Black and Native-led communities work together. But there are some reasons why that hasn't occurred. And so I also don't want it, we're not going to force this group and this group that they have to work on. It's not going to work that way. We hope that there's natural synergy over the course of 2 years through shared understanding of each other's histories, each other's oppression, each other's struggle, each other's resilience. And through that, there'll be space for collaboration. But I do think that we hope that will make sense. We also are in COVID, so we know there may not be a lot of opportunity in 2021 for in-person events, but there's always places to grow. A part of it is just strengthening relationships broadly, and so we hope that will occur. But I appreciate the question, and we will hold that in terms of level of interest to collaborate. That's something that we certainly want to see.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Delbert. And Albertus, your hand is still up. Do you have another question, or is that from earlier?
Yeah, the demographic piece of my question was just around if there's like specific like age groups that you guys would be looking for that you'd be looking for this program or whatever the application that comes in.
When you say age groups, like your organization serving? No, I mean I do think that we'll probably want to have some level of diversification. If, in terms of like, if all of the groups that are selected all serve youth, I mean, that's totally a possibility. I would say it's up to the review committee. This is one of those places where, like, regardless of how I might do it or how For Culture might do it or how Office of Arts and Culture will do it, the community reviewers, they're going to call it how they see it. But I will say that some level of diversification is always probably really important to see. So I'm sure there will be certain organizations that serve youth, some that serve elders, some that work in disability spaces, some that might be queer, trans. We also want to focus on marginalized intersectional identities as well. Geography is also important. Thinking of diversification of grants from around the county, depending on who applies. Ideally, there might be some East King County representation, South King County representation. I think those things come up in terms of like geography and demographics.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And then we only have a few minutes left. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm new to this area over here, but my question is that, is it required that we are affiliated with a Black-led community or organization that would bring us in?
No, it is not. It is not. No, you can apply on your own. You do not have to have an affiliation. Like for a Black-led organization, they don't have to have a specific affiliation with Indigenous-led, Native-led, Pacific Islander-led, and vice versa. Organizations will apply as you'll apply as your own organization. You'll share about the work that your organization does. I'd say it's a place where you get the opportunity to just share about what it is that you do, about the community that you serve. And if by chance your organization is selected, then you'd be a part of a cohort with other Native-led, other Indigenous-led, and other Black-led organizations. That's the space where collaboration can occur, but it certainly is not a requirement. Because again, we know that there are let's say, based on all the hegemonic white supremacy aspects that we don't even need to get into, there are a variety of reasons why sometimes communities are not communicating, why nonprofits that are often forced to compete for resources are sometimes it's just a very real thing. So there's no knock against an organization that doesn't have strong relationships. If you do have, but I will say, if you're a Native-led organization or Indigenous-led organization and you do have strong relationships with other Black-led organizations, please name that, and vice versa. As a Black-led organization, if you happen to have any strong relationships with Native-led, Indigenous-led organizations, name it. But if not, it's okay. This will be a space where hopefully that can occur.
Yes, thank you very much for clarifying that. And it is going to be an awesome thing to work together. And thanks for invitation for coming up and listening and taking questions. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for being here.
Yes, and I'm going to be sitting here and listening to some good questions here too. Appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I know we have a few more hands raised. I saw Toya, Adam, and then Toka.
Diana, I just wanted to clarify an earlier question, and I wanted to make sure it got answered because I think I interpreted it a little differently. When someone was speaking about language barriers, I interpreted the question to mean as applicants, potential applicants are applying, will there be services to help applicants who English is a second language? Is there support that will be provided?
Thank you for asking that. And Jonathan, I'm actually going to toss that one to you.
At present, we don't have anything like that. I think if folks can reach out sort of on a case-by-case basis, we can see what we do. We can see what we can do to figure it out. I just want to better understand who that community is. We will. There's always a way to make it work. But I will say that the applications right now, even as they'll be coming in English, and ideally the community reviewers. My understanding that their first language is English, and so we would have to sort of figure that out. But of course, feel free to email me, and I'm just going to put my email. If any organization has a question around that, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you can just reach out directly.
Yeah, and I think as a funders collaborative, we can also take that question to the group and see about how we can pool our, capacity and resources to support. Just naming that too. Adam.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I have another question. So if an organization is working with the general public to serve Black or Indigenous groups, for example, through the humanities like history, telling the stories of Black or Indigenous people to the wider public, is that eligible?
Yes, if the organization is led by Black and or Indigenous people. So really because the purpose of this grant in so many ways is to, you know, address structural racism at all points in sort of the funding cycle. And so that includes, you know, who actually gets the money, where our investments are going.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And Toka, I believe you had a hand raised.
Yes, so thank you. Again, so my question I think is around the answering the maybe the narrative in the application around connecting our work to dismantling structural racism. So I'm just curious around how we can at least it's just as far as answering, like, do we have to connect what we're doing to some larger community effort towards structural racism, or because I do believe that the work we're doing is in general very much about dismantling racism. I'm just curious around how we should answer that so that it looks as best as possible.
Totally. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I mean, I think that comes back to, you know, you telling your story and how you see that connection. We're definitely not asking people to connect to like an existing, you know, community-wide effort, but some may choose to do that or may already be doing that. But, you know, how, in your own words, is your work already doing that? And the work of addressing structural racism, not connecting to a bigger community-wide effort. I think there's a question in the chat about cohort time being compensated.
Yeah, I'm just going to write that one out.
Okay.
And yes, absolutely. Yes. Organizations that are selected to participate in the Creative Equity Fund cohort will receive up to $30,000 per year for 2 years, totaling $60,000. And so that is a grant that will be made to the organization directly, and those dollars can be expended as they see fit. So that is meant to compensate the time participating in the cohort and for you to do the work that you're doing.
We do provide food and space and sometimes like some additional element for those cohort gatherings. And I know that we're at time. So as I said, my email is in the chat. Hopefully everyone got a chance to see that, j.cunningham@seattlefoundation.org. This webinar is recorded, so we'll get a chance to post this probably in a couple of days. And if you have other questions, feel free to reach out. We're really looking forward to having hopefully a robust group of Black and Indigenous-led organizations that apply for this. Thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to connecting again. Let us know if you have other questions. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate you all.
Thank you very much. Stay blessed.
Likewise.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Kunistish, kunistish.
Thank you.